Good morning, everyone, from rainy Brussels. Thank you for joining our webinar on the Sustainable Transport Forum guidelines on for public authorities. I hope you can see my screen. Shofia, can you just confirm if you can see my screen? Thank you. So before we start, I just want to mention this webinar is going to be recorded. So I hope it's not a problem for you. It's just for future dissemination and for the people that could not join. This becomes a reference for consultation. So today I am joined by Alexander Klinke from the European Commission, DG Move, Aaron Fishbone from Greenway, and later this morning, Raphael Helio from E-Mobility Europe. So what we are going to present is 3 recent guidelines that were published or are about to be published under the Sustainable Transport Forum subgroup on public authorities. The tenders for public EV charging, accessibility for charging infrastructure, but also guidance on fire safety. And then we want to hear a bit from you, what in your opinion, what are we still missing, if you were aware of this. So this is kind of the first event that we as POLIS are hosting to try to bring awareness for the work done during the STF. Before we start, I just wanted to explain why we are here today. So I went into the EAFO portal to see the most recent numbers, and currently, and these are the second quarter of 2025, we have around 21 million alternative fuel cars and vans, so 7% of the total fleet. This fleet is growing, and of these, about 1/3 are fully electric, 4 million plug-in. There's currently almost 1 million public EV charging points in Europe, mostly AC, so around 8 out of 10. And AFIR seems to be a strong enabler for this. It was published in 2023, has ambitious targets, not just for urban areas, but also on the corridors. Alexandra will explain this a bit better, but we expect this continuous growth of both the fleet and the charging infrastructure. However, if we look into the Green Deal objectives, they expect 20 million battery electric vehicles by 2030, and this requires 3.5 million charging points by 2030. So we're talking about around 700,000 chargers per year. So we still have a long way to go, and the current adoption and the current implementation needs to be accelerated. Cities, regions, other public authorities will play a key role on this. They are the managers of the public space where most of the chargers are installed. They have their own sustainable mobility strategies. They want to become climate neutral. They are key partners and key contributors for this e-mobility transition. However, we still understand that cooperation, multi-stakeholder dialogue and guidance are needed, and this is why we are here today to explain a bit what STF does and how we aim to support public authorities on charging infrastructure. Before we start with the presentations, I just wanted to share first one question with you, because we wanted to assess how much people are aware of these guidelines. So I would ask you to please join Mentimeter, either via this QR code or on the website, menti.com, and then you just put this code. I am going to go back to Mentimeter. So I hope you can see. But I'm going to ask you to please vote. First, were you aware of the STF guidelines before this event? We want to know, because it's a lot of work that's being done. And if they don't reach the audience, it's a bit pointless, to be honest. So more people were not aware. So this is already worth it, I guess, Alexander and Aaron, to organize this. Of course, we can always do more events, but I'm really happy just by looking into these answers at the moment that we organize this webinar. Now it's a bit more 50-50. Yes.
Pedro, I was just going to say, hi, everyone. I was looking at the attendance list right now while you were sharing it. And, I work in e-mobility full time for 10 years, and I only recognize two people whose names are on this list. So, clearly we're reaching a new audience or people beyond the usual stakeholders at some of these events. So for those 25 people whose names who are brand new to me, it's great that you're here and you're learning about these guidelines through this event.
Indeed. Clap, clap, clap. I have to say, I'm very happy too, Aaron. So maybe while we let other people respond, we already have a nice idea here. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm not surprised with these responses. I got a bit this impression that we have this responsibility today to explain and because this is hard work, and the people from the commission, but also Aaron and Rafael will agree with me. This is hard work. This takes a long time, and if we are doing this and people are not aware, then it's a bit frustrating. But so really happy to move forward, and now I will give the floor to Alexandra. She will explain a little bit the context and what is the STF, because I'm aware that probably some of you do not know the guidelines, but also do not know what the STF is all about. So Alexandra, please, I'll give the floor to you now. You are muted, Alexandra.
Yeah, hello to everybody. I'm very happy to participate in this event today. I work in DG Move in the team which works on alternative fuels infrastructure, and in fact, what is here I would like to maybe make a kind of introduction how we work. So apart from proposing legislative proposals like AFIR that you probably all know, but I will also present like shortly what is about, we work with stakeholders because, and this is the Sustainable Transport Forum. Why? Because we think that by a dialogue with stakeholders, we can have a lot of input for our further work, but also we can complement the legislation by recommendation and guidelines. So it is easier for stakeholders to implement our legislation. And here stakeholders, they are, of course, like the producers of infrastructures, but also CPOs, then mobility service providers, but also local authorities are very, very important, and regional and national, of course, to implement this legislation. So, as I said, STF was already set in 2015 because in 2014 there was already adopted directive on alternative fuels. So this
Alexandra, sorry to interrupt. Just to are you moving the slides forward, or are you, because we still see the first slide?
Okay. So I will.
Thank you.
This is the first one. And now?
Yes, it's good.
Yes.
Now it's working.
So STF serves as a platform for structured dialogue, and there are also representative of member states, like exactly like national and regional and local authorities. Now, just to tell you what is a structure, there are different subgroups. There is implementing subgroups for AFIR. There are governance and standard subgroup, data subgroup, our group from which come all these guidelines that we want to present you, public authorities. Then there are heavy-duty vehicles subgroup, hydrogen subgroup, and PKI for e-mobility subgroup. There are in total around 200 appointed members, and there are in subgroup different thematic task force which prepare corresponding guidelines. Here you can see the link to Sustainable Transport Forum when you can get more information, and I will put it in the chat in some moments. Now, just to tell you exactly, maybe I will not repeat what said already Pedro, that we prepared quite a number of these guidelines, which I will also put in the chat. And exactly, it took us a lot of time, but we did it with all our heart because we thought that there is this need, and we would like that to reach as many stakeholders as possible, because we think that it could be of help, and some stakeholders don't have enough of capacity to prepare, for example, themselves a good tender for rollout of recharging infrastructure, or they don't know how to approach fire safety for electric vehicles without discouraging themselves of doing this. So there are different aspects, and I hope they bring a positive outlook and encouragement. Now, just to remind you, AFIR had different targets, and all these guidelines help to reach these guidelines. There are guidelines which are linked to the fleet, and for each electric vehicles, we need to provide so and so much capacity of electricity in kilowatts. Then there are distance-based targets for light-duty vehicles, charging points, but also for heavy-duty vehicles. And it concerns TNT core networks and TNT comprehensive networks, and in the distance of 60 kilometers. And you see that there are different capacity again demanded. And this is just to cover all main roads connecting different member states. So there is a coherent network of recharging points, this fast recharging points, which allow to go to transport goods, but also to allow passengers, individual people, not to have this anxiety they cannot charge. So here you have this targets for heavy-duty vehicles, and for these ones we have also the targets for putting infrastructure in safe and secure parking, so they can charge overnight and in urban nodes. As you can see, for the moment, what you also can see in European Alternative Fuels Observatory, I will put all the links if you don't know. For that, you can find a lot of information. Actually, all member states currently overachieve on their fleet-based targets, except Malta and Cyprus, because also some of them, they are very ambitious, like France, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, and others, but there are also others which don't have such a big fleet of electric vehicles. So it's for them easy to match with charging infrastructure. So we can expect that in the following years there will be more and more EVs on the road, and then will be more effort to match this with charging infrastructure. I will not go into details, but AFIR not only present targets, but also different methods, different measures to increase friendliness for users. Among them, there is like rules for easy payment, then requirements for fair, transparent, and easy comparable prices. And here there are some details that you can probably see by afterwards sending my presentation, but just wanted to pinpoint this. So it is to attract people for using electric vehicles. There are also some other aspects. So it is required that recharging points are ready for smart charging, which will be important for the future for also diminishing the cost for individual users, but also for helping balance the grids of electricity. There are also provisions on data. So this data, dynamic, static, will be provided from CPOs to national access points, and then they can be available for each users. And this data will be important just to see, for example, if given recharging station is operable or is for example, is accessible for people, for disabled people, and so on. So this we presented for this delegated and implemented acts on data, but also on standards, which are also important for like kind of coherence rollout of recharger infrastructure in the EU, and this has been lately published. So thank you very much. It was just an introduction, and then I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra. Looking forward for continuous cooperation with DG Move on making sure that the mobility transition is a success from the side of the vehicle, but also from the side of the charging infrastructure, because one without the other simply will not work. I don't see any remarks in the chat, so I will give the floor to Aaron. He's going to present one of the first guidelines that were published in the recent batch, let's say, of documents, and one of really high importance for the public authorities, which is about the guidelines on tenders, how to organize the tender procedure, how to make sure that you install the chargers in your territory. It's quite inspiring. Aaron is also quite an inspiring presenter, so I will give now the floor to you. And again, if you have any questions, remarks, immediately reactions, post it on the chat. Aaron, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I hope I live up to that introduction. Can everyone see my screen now? Okay, super. So my name is Aaron Fishbone. I am the Director of Public Policy for Greenway. We're an integrated charge point operator and mobility service provider operating throughout Central and Eastern Europe. So we operate a large network of public charging stations. We provide non-public charging to different companies who are interested in deploy or residences or corporate offices or logistics hubs, depots to any interested parties. And we also directly serve EV driving customers as their mobility service provider. So we cover all of those different lines of the business, and I'm a member of the Sustainable Transport Forum and was working on this particular report. This report was published in March of this year, so after a little over a year of work by members of the STF, and we got a lot of different inputs from all over Europe, and really the situation with public tenders really varies across Europe. So you might see things that reflect your community, you might see things that seem very different and are shocking to you compared to what you experience on the ground, and all of that is sort of encompassed here. And we are aware of huge regional variations and variations by member state practice and whatnot, and that is the nature of the market that we are in today. So without further ado, I will go forward. The purpose of this document is really designed to be practical document for public authorities who are interested in offering tenders or concessions for public recharging services. So the previous version of this, which was published in the year 2020, was almost 300 pages long. A lot of that was updated and discussions were concluded in the AFIR regulation itself by the requirements put out there. And this document is now less than 50 pages with numerous checklists and really kind of handy use guides and handy use materials for public authorities as you're considering how to deploy, what that deployment looks like, how to create tenders, and how to plan for tenders that you might be considering for public recharging services. So without further ado, here is the structure of the document as it is right now. It's in 4 main parts. The first part is a sort of an introduction to the market dynamics today, very briefly, and also to the relevant regulations that are likely to touch upon the requirements for public recharging services. So AFIR, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, the Renewable Energy Directive, which has certain requirements or certain, let's say, priorities and objectives that are relevant here, and also the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which also has certain requirements and let's say, objectives which touch here as well. Also, we found through the course of this work that the European Investment Bank had also put out a very handy guide to concessions for public authorities. And so we met with them numerous times throughout the process, and we also integrated a lot of their findings here. Again, the point of our guide is to be an updated for 2025 handy reference guide for you. So we wanted to put the most relevant materials into one central place for easy access and easy use. And as you see, the other elements are here. First, at the high level about planning deployment approaches, then at the much more granular, kind of tender specific level of organizing those procedures more concretely, and then finally consolidating the technical tender requirements from the relevant legislations into the final section of the report. Again, many of these are in the form of checklists to make it easy for you to use. So briefly, as we said, it's a single reference guide for public authorities. We include the specific requirements that you would need to adhere to, as well as suggestions for other requirements or other that you might want to submit to as a part of your tender, like data sharing requirements, additional data sharing, interoperability requirements, and things like that, performance measures and things like that that you could look at and consider in the course of developing your own tender guidelines. And as I said, we looked across Europe. So we have case studies from 9 different public authorities in multiple different member states, as well as one corporate case study as well, because it's very interesting about co-locating storage and renewable energy generation along with fast charging. And so really took a very wide view for what we were looking for, what was in the scope of the document. But it is limited to recharging services for light duty vehicles. This does not take on the topic of heavy duty vehicles, nor does it take on the topic of public financing of public recharging, rather just the tendering procedures and concession approaches. So why first planning is so important. Even in the early stages, because really, EV charging bridges transport and energy like never before. And frankly, our communities have not had to be in touch and not had to communicate very much ever before, because, liquid fuel just being brought around in barrels really didn't require communicating with the, distribution system and the transmission system and, the lines in the ground and the public authorities and whatnot. And that is all completely changing now. And yet, because even with, over almost 1 million public chargers and almost 8 million private chargers already deployed throughout Europe, there are still very early in the conversations between the power sector and the transport sector. And so absolutely any ways that public authorities as well, but also to bring our communities together to be having conversations that are specific to your local community, your local city, your local country are still absolutely critical and cannot start soon enough. I cannot overemphasize this point. It may seem so obvious, but as someone who works for a CPO, we are absolutely need to have many, many, many more conversations with local distribution system operators, especially, and public authorities to align together our objectives, our growth plans with where the DSO is going to be in building out, where their investments are going, and things like that. Also to set expectations accordingly so that power levels that are requested or required either under AFIR or under the specific tender requirements that you are developing are aligned with what's actually possible based on the local DSO situation. Is there overcapacity on the grid? Is there undercapacity? Aligning these things early before tenders are developed is absolutely essential. I really cannot overemphasize this point enough, nor can the STF group. Everything I'm saying is a result of all of our, let's say, shared discussions. So also, yes, and also as you develop sustainable urban mobility plans, long-term for municipalities, long-term energy plans for the DSO and the TSO, and everyone else who needs to comply with AFIR, so member states and CPOs in particular, we all need to be having these conversations together to slowly align together. And especially for local municipalities, this touches on things like your local, land use plans and vision. How do you want to use the public space? What is your local parking policy? And does that fit with where you are suggesting charging take place? Should it be low power AC charging, or should it be high power DC charging? Where, if you want, do you want to put those different types of charging, and what does that mean for the use of the public space in your community? All of these things are very, very relevant, and so they're things that need to be discussed. And when planned properly, this can lead to much, much more grid-friendly EV charging, where charging can be done in a way that is supportive, that is balanced with where the grid is today, and even maybe done in a way that lets provide services or provides relief to the grid during peak times, and in locations where there is available capacity, as opposed to where it is congested. And what is the stage of market that your municipality is in is also, or your country is in, is also very relevant. And here you see some different ways of looking at deploying EV charging. The first is strategic, which is more planned and top down. So let's say you are looking broadly at your community and you say, we're going to put charging here, here, and here, because again, it aligns with the other public policy goals that we have for land use and where we think, people are living and where we want charging to be by shopping centers and things like that. But then, over time, as the market develops a bit more, it can be more utilization based. What are we seeing based upon the data that is coming from the operators that they are sharing with us, also now required under AFIR, and now we can see where are people actually charging in our community. We have some data to base further investment decisions on or further tendering decisions on. And then finally, ultimately, it can be demand based. Where are people asking for chargers to be installed, and how can we serve that demand? So it really, as the market grows, your deployment plan can change as well, and your deployment approach can evolve. Pedro, by the way, in terms of time, I forgot to start my timer, so please let me know. But I will go relatively quickly here. Again, I just want to mention the topics that are covered in the report. I will not go through the checklists and things. Alexandra, I see, is sharing the links, and I want to leave time for discussion. Happy to answer specific questions. But, as we talk about specific tenders, and again, I want to say this cuts across, from low power, public AC charging all the way to like highway, fast charging. Let's say the specifics are different, but the general applications are relatively similar. First, of course, is even at the level of individual locations and power demands at individual locations, it is important to communicate with the DSO, with the distribution system operator, in order to understand what is really possible there today and what would be useful or hurtful from their perspective. And maybe that can evolve over time as the AFIR requirements also evolve over time. Communicating between different branches of the public authority, the civil works requirements with the IT infrastructure, with, let's say, other things that need to go under the ground. If you're going to rip up the road one time to do a bunch of civil works, maybe you can plan for what is going to be coming in a few years already, at once. So the one-step principle. Important to make sure that when you offer a public tender, you are advertising it widely, maybe to international operators as well, who could come in, so that it is a really competitive bid process and you are receiving bids from really competent companies, but also to make sure that whoever is actually in your bidding process is able to deliver the recharging services. Yeah, there is really a balance between, let's say, having an open competitive marketplace, especially for new market entrants, and making sure that whoever is in your, let's say, selection process is actually able to really deliver recharging services in a way that benefits the customers. And so balancing these requirements and balancing these objectives is an important part of developing the tender documentation. And we have some case studies in the report that really look at different ways of finding this balance. The size of the tender lot, the power level, things like that, all things that you can consider. Yep. And then also, how are you announcing tenders via open calls, international trade associations, EU portals, and whatnot? We found many of them don't appear on EU portals, actually. Many of them, even though they're big national highway authority tenders, only appear in local magazines, if at all, or if not word of mouth. And so this is something that, greatly needs to be improved. And there are case studies as well, which talk in the report that talk about things like joint procurement at the regional level, beyond just any one municipality or one doing it by itself. Finding strength in numbers, joint procurement, sharing documentation, so that and then also making sure that whatever services are tendered for are interoperable for all of the regional players, so that drivers can travel throughout the region seamlessly. Yes, a lot of input came from the field, from experiences we've had over the last few years, from 2020 when the first document was done until today. Lots of different experiences with public tenders, and so we got a lot of good input based upon what's actually happening out there in the markets. I already talked about the pre-selection process, de-risking tender development. This refers to a few things because, again, let's say the market uptake varies. Yeah, there are a few member states that have really high penetration of EVs, and there are some that are quite low, in particular, for example, where I am in Slovakia. So therefore, but the infrastructure still costs a lot of money. And plus, if there's civil works and additional grid infrastructure that needs to be required, these locations can cost quite a lot of money. So how do you ensure that there is still a return on investment for the private operator that is investing that capital very early, and their investors very early and upfront, and then it gets paid back over the lifetime of the tender? So there was a case study in the report about a city in Croatia, which realized that it had to change its local laws in order to extend the tender duration for public charging so that there was an opportunity for the operator to recoup its investment over a longer period of time because there was so much being invested up front. So how do you de-risk it in a world where there's very high upfront costs and then lower utilization, although growing over time? As the EV fleet in that market grows, and then let's say people travel to that country with their electric vehicles from abroad. What are different ways of structuring the concession fee? Upfront payments, rental payments. What is the balance between variable and fixed payments that might be required? Are also discussed in the report. How do you, when you, in your tender documentation, ensure that there is an opportunity to maybe build out further locations when you see high demand at some location for the operator to install additional charging points and maybe get additional power to that location because it is what we're seeing in the market being reflected, and therefore that's where the need is. So how do documents be written in a way to allow that type of flexibility while also engaging and making sure that minimum services are being addressed? And then in particular, vis-a-vis, the Renewable Energy Directive and its requirements for co-locating, where power is used and the time and the place of charging and also generation. So how can your documentation also permit and encourage the co-location of storage and res generation, and in fact, specifically not penalize it, are also very important things. A few specific requirements, and then I'll move on for your questions, is, this idea of the AB system, where locations are broken up into different tranches. And so there can be numerous winners of any single round of tenders so that they're not giving a monopoly to any single operator. And you're ensuring that there is redundancy in the system and that users have the ability to choose between different operators, that operators are competing to deliver the best services at the good prices. And also to ensure that again, if God forbid some operator fails, that there is other operators still operational in that area to provide those services. Or in the case of highways, so that at one location you have operator A, another location operator B, and so on and so forth. That's what it means by the AB system. Given the situation with grid capacity and the high upfront costs and also the potentially low utilization or other business case considerations, we recommend not having two locations that are at the same space being offered to different operators, or any one location is considered one batch of the tender, as opposed to it being split up into two small but closely grouped parcels, because then you really undermine the business case there, and you create additional strains on the grid, such that it might undermine the purpose of delivering the recharging services in the first place. We talk about how do you address legacy locations where there might be an operator well before e-mobility was really conceived as a mainstream transport form. There might be legacy applications or legacy, let's say, contract holders or concession holders who maybe do not want to offer recharging services. So how do you engage in that situation? And also the importance of treating EV recharging services as a specialized professional business and unbundling it from other things like offering concessions and other fuels and whatnot. And then we have a lengthy discussion of types of performance measures that you can engage in, including your contracting language, to ensure proper oversight of the tender, and different, let's say, penalties for non-compliance at various stages of the procedure. Finally, the report ends with technical tender requirements, really quite specific ones. Many of them come from AFIR directly, but we have consolidated them into a single checklist, and then additional recommendations that are not in AFIR, but which the STF working group felt are important for public authorities to consider, including roaming and openness protocols, open protocols in general. For example, in case if an operator were to go out of business, what could happen with that legacy infrastructure so that it doesn't become stranded or go to waste. Energy efficiency and eco-design, which is something that is being considered by the Commission now and might appear in future documentation. And then also the topic of accessibility and which we'll discuss further in today's webinar. So I will stop there and open it up for any questions or comments or feedback.
Thank you, Aaron. Very, very efficient and time-wise. Any remarks, any questions, please raise your hand or write directly in the chat. Just let's go first for the 1 or 2 immediate reactions. If I don't see anyone writing, I have one question for you, Aaron, if you don't mind. So these guidelines are published. Now they are supposed to be put into practice. If 1 year from now or 2 years from now we have to produce new guidelines, what do you think should be the main focus of these, let's say, future guidelines? What do you think could be addressed that might be an issue that we haven't, based on your own experience, of course? I know it's not an easy question.
It's not an easy question, but I mean, quickly, I would say first, these are limited to light duty vehicles. So the entire discussion around heavy duty vehicles and whether where there's not hybrid locations, where they need dedicated, recharging spaces, but are still considered open, could be, let's say, a separate document, but might be an area where this type of publication could be useful. It's a little more specific in that they're not going to probably be so much in urban locations and whatnot, but nonetheless, that could be an entire body of work that could be done adjacent to this, and hopefully that market will be much bigger in 2 years' time. I think also the issue of how does the grid evolve is going to be another big topic. So we've covered that extensively here, but I mean, as the market grows, and it's growing quickly. If you see the 2025 growth, kind of growth numbers, it's happening in front of us. That the issues facing the grid could be different, and these are very local topics, right? Like one community, one operator is very congested here, but there's a lot of capacity there. So how do we think about the grid and EV charging, and also the whole issue of maybe dynamic tariffs where there is much more opportunity for that? How could that be featured into this, into how public authorities think about where EV charging should take place, how it should take place? And I think all of those could be things that the market will grow a lot. A lot of things will happen in the next 2 years. I mean, it is really quite dynamic and advancing quite quickly. And so I think those are all things that will be much further along in 2 years' time than they are today. So we've sort of addressed them, but I think there'll be very different conversations in 2 years' time.
Thank you. Alexandra, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I would add that it is in our plans to prepare like separate guidelines for heavy duty vehicles, but in cooperation, like in the leader by the subgroup on heavy duty vehicles. So you could expect this from us. And it is possible that we could work on kind of annexes if we see that new issue arises. If we think that guidelines, like a basis of our guidelines, is still kind of relevant, and I think that also probably the question of smart in bi-directional charging will be more developed in the coming years, and this would also probably be worth working on.
Yeah,
Indeed.
I think that, yeah. Also, I mean, Pedro, I would just add also too that already we have implementing guidelines from the Commission for some of the technical requirements under AFIR. So we could, I mean, already add those into an annex or even update the technical requirements section now that those guidelines are already exist. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Knut. Could you please further elaborate on the recommendation?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are two main factors here. First is the state of the grid. I mean, it is very expensive and time consuming to get a connection to a grid point. We see it can take up to 3 years in some locations to get a grid connection point. And there is a huge discussion taking place about how to kind of address the grid. The EU has the Grids Action Plan. There's a lot of people working on this right now. And it really varies, again, across communities, across operators, and across markets. So, but the idea that it takes a long time, that it's very expensive, or could be very expensive if you need additional reinforcements like transformer stations at those locations. That and in a world of especially of lower utilization, where there are still not so many electric vehicles, that there is to justify that it could undermine the business case if you have competing operators in too small of a zone who each need to get a independent grid connection point and then offer competing recharging services at the same location could effectively undermine the point. So it's very, very expensive for each operator then to connect and build out at that location, and where there's not enough utilization for either one, you risk undermining the interest or the incentive either one would have or more to invest at that location.
Thank you,
So,
Aaron.
of course, you should have redundancy. Again, per the ABAB suggestion, there should be open tenders. There should be multiple winners and broken into different areas, either in a municipality or in along highways and roadways, but not to have that be too close together so that you're addressing these two topics.
Stimulating
Does that answer your question?
Efficiency. I hope, Knut, this answered your question, but maybe we can then have more discussions or bilateral discussions after this event. I think we can maybe share our contacts and making sure that if you have any other there is now another question from Pallavi. This is quite a long question, so I think I'll leave it for the end, because on view of time, I will have also to move along and present the guidelines on accessibility. So now it's my turn. Thank you, Aaron, and I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
So these are guidelines that are not yet published. They are soon to be, just to be to set up expectations, but we are finalizing them as we speak. And I want to mention also that what we talk about when we mention accessibility, because this is something that happened a lot in the discussions, we're talking about inclusivity, not proximity. So you're talking about developing charging infrastructure that is adequate for persons with disabilities, elderly people, so persons with visual impairments. This is the objective of these guidelines. And how did this process started? Well, basically, there's a story behind it, but also AFIR requires accessibility. In recital 38, they say that the location of the recharging station should be designed in a way that they are accessible and user-friendly. And the same is mentioned on Articles 20 and 21 on data provision. So CPOs are required to provide data on the number of parkings for persons with disabilities. And then on Article 21 and Annex 2, there's also explicit mention to delegated acts to enable access for persons with reduced mobility. But how to do this in practice? Well, that's the challenge. There is other legislation that mentions accessibility, for example, the EU Accessibility Act, but also standards on accessibility on the built environment, but also on digital accessibility. But none of them cover the specific situation of EV recharging infrastructure. So basically what we started a few years ago, some members wanted to implement barrier-free charging infrastructure, but they couldn't find it. And realized that more and more cities were asked to make their charging infrastructure accessible and inclusive, but there wasn't that much where they could look into and find some guidelines. So that's how this became a task force under the Public Authority subgroup on the Sustainable Transport Forum. So, but the idea is also to go beyond what AFIR was mentioning. So also looking into the area, surrounding area, the parking area, etc., etc. So this was a process. It started with the establishment of the task force. So we had meetings during the POLIS conference 2022. We made some exchanges and webinars with other authorities that are more advanced, and in this case, the UK and the United States. They started before. So we also discussed with them what are their challenges, what were their lessons learned. And there's other events organized under EU research and innovation projects like UserChi, where this was also discussed. And finally, even last week, some of us were in EVS 38, and there was a specific panel to discuss accessibility. It was quite interesting and realized that this is indeed something that needs to be in the agenda. So when we design these guidelines, we are looking at this specific scope. So not just the charging station, but also the surrounding area, the parking and the built environment. and then a bit more looking into the data for the user and the information. And finally, something that was asked by the Commission, how to establish a metric for distribution or location. So we understand that not all of them can be accessible or are accessible, so we should start, and what metric should be a fixed percentage, should be location-based. And during this process, we realized that just a fixed percentage will not be enough because they can all be located in the same space. So we need to be creative and think about alternative ways and making sure that this distribution is equitable. So the guidelines, they're almost published and they have the following structure. So we give an introduction to the topic. During the work, we sent a survey to the STF members and beyond to ask them specific questions. I'm going to mention two of them. We put a little bit of the analysis in the report, and then we look into the state of the art, because there's a lot in between the start of this process and the publication of the guidelines. Several useful documents were published in the UK, in Ireland, in Germany, in Spain, that informed our own documents. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. We just want to make sure that what we do is kind of aligned or structured in a way that it doesn't contradict what's already in place. And then we put some practices, standards, lessons learned. We populate every now and then with examples so people can refer to these existing guidelines and to understand better what's behind, or the reasoning behind. And finally, some recommendations for minimal requirements. So, for example, what was really obvious when we did the survey is that indeed lack of common standards. So each member state has its own standards. Some of them have, some of them don't. So for charge point manufacturers, from operators, even for the cities, it's not easy to understand what shall we do. So this was by far the biggest bottleneck. The absence of a clear regulatory framework, I guess it's related to the first one, and then the lack of available public space. So if we want to make charging more inclusive, of course, we need a little bit more space. And if you look into the old city centers, this might be a challenge. And then also when it comes to the responsibility, it was interesting to see that when it comes to the policy and regulations, the respondents say that it's institutions, so EU and national level, should take the lead on this, whereas for the physical implementation is more the private operators or public-private partnerships. For dissemination and communication will be national authorities. Capacity building, well, the distribution of the responsibility is a bit more even. But coming from a network of cities and regions, I was also surprised that to see that local and regional authorities, well, they are kind of in the middle ground. They do not, they are not responsible for anything, but in the end, they are responsible for the management of the public space. So their voice needs to be heard too. These were some of the existing guidelines and references that we consulted and that we worked with. So from Ireland, the Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Guidelines, but then the UK, the very known PAS 1899, but also the design guidance from Motability. There was recommendations in Sweden, the United States. So we had a nice exchange with the US Access Board. Of course, they have different contexts. For them, space is not an issue, but they do have some interesting lessons that we could use. Finally, there's this now new report from Crow, specifically about charging cables in the sidewalks, which are also an aspect of accessibility. So these were some of the references and examples that we look into. All of them kind of working towards making charging accessible, with some small differences, of course. But in the end, more of them, the majority of them are very much aligned. We also understood that we need some kind of standard for accessibility in public recharging infrastructure. So these guidelines are recommendations, so they are not enforced. They do not enforce anything. We just recommend. And what exists currently, they do not fully address all requirements from AFIR. So we will have to work on that. And this is something that started in parallel to the work on this task force. So the Commission started discussing also with standardization bodies to see how we can define this new standard with minimal requirements that will apply to different use cases, because we are, again, talking from different perspectives, as Aaron mentioned. One thing is charging in urban environments. Other thing is, for example, charging in a highway or in a hub. So the requirements are different, the conditions are different, and this needs to be considered. So I'm just going to now point some of the recommendations that we have there. So the document will be public, so you'll be able to see. So we mentioned, for example, intervals. We don't want to promote a specific, let's say, metric for the design of the charging station. We look into other recommendations. We just want to ensure that, for example, when it comes to a screen, it shouldn't be too low, because of course, if it's too low, it also becomes inaccessible for very tall people. So based on the recommendations from these different guidelines, we know more or less what should be the dimensions of a charger, but also the parking space or the maneuvering area around. It's also important that we align with the European Accessibility Act, and we've been discussed with DG Employment too, and they were part of the work, and they were part of the team to make sure that what we propose does not conflict to what is being done under their work. For the spatial distribution, so we need to consider not just a minimum percentage when this is established, but also a spatial distribution to be done in an equitable way. So, for example, we have the example of France, where they establish a percentage that decreases while the number of the chargers grows. So this is really interesting because it establishes a minimum percentage, but at the same time, it says that it's up to the regional area to be responsible for this. So if all of them are in the same, let's say, local municipality, this is not equitable, although it's complying with the percentage. So this is the kind of nuances that we need to consider when we look into the spatial distribution. For future standards, so I'm not going to go into more details. So this is ongoing, let's say. It's not going to be, so these standards are not going to be part of the guidelines because it takes time. But we will make sure that during the discussion, we consider the different use cases, but also respect, of course, the needs of the companies, for the charge point operators, the manufacturers. So we don't want to be too ambitious. We agree that it's not possible to make all current charging points accessible, but we should start and then at least ensure that some of them are fully accessible and then build from there. Finally, there's also other recommendations on the governance levels and stakeholder cooperation. Again, this seems like a cliche, but it's really important. These guidelines will be an intermediate step until a new standard is published. And really important also in the end that disabled EV users should have easy access to information and to provide feedback. There was interesting learnings for me, so I had to educate myself on the topic. So whenever we look into a charger and we see, for example, this is just an example, the color code, green, red, blue for charging being available, out of operation or charging, but if a person is colorblind, they will not be able to clearly see and distinguish this. So this is the kind of things that we need to consider when we design charging infrastructure. Thank you very much. Expect these guidelines to be finalized by end of June. So I'm now collecting the inputs from not just, or not collecting, working on the inputs by the Commission, but also the STF members. And well, I have a big homework to do because I set up to my own internal deadline to have this and finalized by end of the month. So expect this to be published very soon. And thank you so much. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. Happy to respond to any immediate remarks or questions. I know this is quite intense, but and it's a lot of information to process. Thank you, Alexander. Yeah, smart charging is indeed. Or other innovations such as, and I didn't mention this, wireless charging could also be important in terms of accessibility. Of course, this is a niche use case, but if the user doesn't need to interact with any kind of infrastructure, of course, this also supports inclusivity. Yes, Alexandra.
I just have a question for all participants. Like if you, how to say, how relevant you see this question of accessibility for disabled people in your experience. For example, do you have some requirements in different member states that you need to adjust to this, and would a kind of the standard at the European level would help you to have a clear picture what is needed or not. Like, we would like to also hear your views. So please, like, share with us.
Don't be shy. You can maybe write in the chat. Don't need to be exactly now, but if you can maybe share some of your inputs in the chat, that would be great, because for us is very important information and feedback. It was interesting to see, just maybe as a side note, during the panel on accessibility discussion during EVS 38, there was a coordinator of a EU-funded project where we are cooperating with, that mentioned this and it was kind of a shame, saying, yeah, the project has been ongoing for 2 years and not even once we discussed accessibility, and so it's indeed very under the radar. And Katerina, yeah, it's true. Limited parking spaces, but also sometimes lack of knowledge. We need to educate ourselves on the topic. I didn't know anything about accessibility because I'm not a person with a disability. For me, everything seems obvious. And then we start talking with the people, and they sometimes don't have they don't have a voice in the public space because of also other limitations related to mobility for persons with disabilities. So we don't see them as much, and we assume that there aren't that many. But if we consider not just the persons with disabilities, but also the elderly people, and we are becoming older, and the cable is heavy, especially in fast charging, and the letters sometimes are small, and people and the screen sometimes is not bright enough. So this is the kind of things that we should consider. Of course, this is the first step. But if we don't start to it now, when, as Aaron's correctly mentioned, so now that the charging infrastructure is being fastly deployed, if we don't do it correctly from scratch, it's become a problem. It becomes a problem because then you need a lot of refurbishment, and that's costly and takes a lot of time. This should be put as must request for the national highway operators. Indeed, we can have maybe at least one that is fully accessible. And it's interesting also to see that the differences between fast and slow charging and how there was a big discussion on reserved versus prioritized parking spaces. But yeah, not just for the national highway operators, but towards the whole ecosystem, I would say this should be a priority. Alexander. You are muted.
I see that it is challenging issues, but for example, do you think that all like places should be at once adjusted, or we should just try to start with some of them, so they're good distributed, for example, in cities, and maybe in the station on the national highways, for example, like in proportion to all recharging points, there is a certain percent which is adjusted, and then if disabled person is coming, then has priority. What are your views also on this? We are simply curious because we know that, for example, for UK, they just require that all recharging points are adjusted, and somehow they think that they manage, And so, what is for other countries?
While people think about your question, Alexandra, I have Guy Yakir asking about how can we support PTAs and stakeholders on wireless charging and exploring and considering. There is indeed now a line of research and innovation under Horizon Europe. Now there's a call actually for wireless charging infrastructure, so low-cost wireless charging infrastructure. There's some previous projects like in CTV and I think also User Chi that looked into this. I guess the cooperation should come because these kind of projects bring together cities, private sector, authorities, OEMs. Some of the findings of these projects, for this takes a bit of time, but some of the findings of these projects might and will be very useful to understand how we can make this work. Katerina saying not at all places, at least one per location. And this is a remark to you, Alexandra. And please align this on SEF calls. Indeed.
Yes, I think SEF calls require this, but sometimes, the requirements are not so clear what is expected. So I think that the standards at the European level can really help in the medium or in and longer term.
Thank you. And given that it's 11 o'clock, I will now give the floor to Rafael, who's been having quite of a rough morning in between a delayed plane and a canceled train. I think he managed to join us. Rafael, are you here?
Yes,
Yes,
good morning.
you are. Good morning.
Good
How
morning.
are you?
I've made it. I've made it. So good to see you all, and thank you for your patience, and glad that I could make it on time. So yeah, I don't know, I've missed the introduction, so I'm maybe going to introduce a bit myself, but I'm Raphaël Eliou. I'm Senior Policy Manager at e-Mobility Europe, so we're the European Association for e-mobility. We represent the entire ecosystem, and together with Alexandra within DG Move, we worked on guidelines to support the fire-safe deployment of charging points and electric vehicles in underground parking lots. I'm going to share my screen in a second. There we go. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Super, great. So yes, a bit of background about this piece of work that we have worked on together with the European Commission. So the situation in Europe, and I mean, this is widely known to all of you, but a majority of EV charging actually happens at private locations. And this often happens in underground locations. We see that a lot of people live in urban areas and have, live in multi-unit buildings and have a garage where they park their cars. We also see that there's a lot of, public underground parking lots, and they all face the challenge of this transition towards e-mobility. What we see is that EV fires can occur. They present unique risks and challenges, which are very different to an internal combustion engine vehicle. And so we have seen in some countries, in some cities, that some authorities have been enacting restrictive legislation, which is not supporting the transition to e-mobility and to zero-emission transport. So we started having a discussion at the European level on all of this. And the idea came as part of the discussion of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive to establish guidelines to support the rollout of EVs in covered parking areas while maintaining fire safety. And so to have those guidelines be part of some of the work of the European Commission. Here is the catch. It will become a bit tricky here. There's two DGs involved. The first one is DG Move, which is all about transport, and the second one is all about energy, which is DG Ener. So bear with me as I explain this, because this is maybe a bit complex, but the EPBD is handled by DG Ener, while the STF is handled by DG Move. The reason why DG Move engaged in this work is because there's already a lot of expertise and a lot of players from the ecosystem that works on, deploying charging points, on deploying e-mobility across Europe. And so we wanted to make sure that we have all this ecosystem gathered to discuss and address what are the challenges actually to deploying EVs and charging points in underground location while keeping it fire safe. Later this year, based on the work that we have done, DG Ener will also publish a larger set of guidelines, which will also address EV fire safety. But rest assured, most of the work that was done within DG Move and the STF is going to be taken to DG Ener. A bit complex, but I prefer explaining it because I think it's quite important for all of you to know all of this. The aim of the guidelines, when we started, was really the first goal was we need to bust myth about EV fires and provide some evidence-based data when it comes to EV fires. How do they occur? How do they work in principle? How do you actually tackle them? And so on, because there's a lot of, myth going around in the media, and we thought, we do need to address it. We do need to have a public authority that does provide some information to other public authorities around Europe for them to make an assessment of the situation based on clear evidence. on top of that, we are providing an overview of existing legislation and guidelines that exist around Europe in different countries, in different cities. I'm sure there are more than what we have in the guidelines because local authorities have a lot of power when it comes to fire safety, but we provide a bit of an overview based on surveys that we have done with all the member states, our members, the members of the STF, and so on and so on. We've received quite a lot of responses, I think over 100, and that has actually fit in to the work that we have done. Furthermore, we identified best practices and challenges when it comes to fire safety in underground parking lots. And the last point is we establish recommendation to maintain fire safety in covered car parks. One point that I also want to emphasize as we begin this session on fire safety, it's important to realize that there are many actors that are involved in fire safety in underground parking lots. And so when we started the work with those guidelines, we gathered actors from the parking sector, from the insurance sector, from the fire fighting sectors, from the e-mobility sector, obviously the charging ones, public authorities, and so on, because we really need to have this group of people gathered to actually have a discussion. Otherwise, it will pull in one direction or the other. So this guideline is very encompassing in some ways. It addresses the challenges of different actors, and it does not support binding decision for each actors, but more recommendation and more, things that could be improved. And the last point I want to make before we delve in is there's different types of buildings, and this is very important to recognize. There's new buildings where it's very easy to actually deploy, let's say, EVs in a more fire-safe ways than for existing buildings where parking spaces may be, smaller than in newer buildings, and where it's more challenging to actually have more spaces between vehicles as vehicles have increased in terms of size across the years. So those are things to take into consideration when reading those guidelines. The structure of the guidelines. So we have created an introduction with a section that debunked the myth. As I said, this was one of the main objectives of the guidelines, and I think this is very much a success because we do explain how does an EV fire works and what are some of the myths that are linked to it and how do we actually tackle those fires. The state of the legislation that I've mentioned, the challenges and risk, existing practices, some recommendation to public authorities and policymakers, but also some recommendation for private stakeholders, because what we see is that a lot of parking lots are actually operated by private operators. And so it's important for them to have also some recommendation on what should they do and how do we actually harmonize those practices around Europe, because if they own parking lots across member states, they want to have solutions that they implement across those member states and not just, per cities as we currently see. And then conclusion and future consideration. Some of the key risks and challenges that we have identified, of course, all the risks that are associated with the lithium-ion batteries. So how does a thermal runaway works? How do charging points affect the potential of this fire, and how do we actually make sure that anything that's related to fires that can stem from charging points are tackled as well? Does the whole situation around human safety and firefighters, how do they actually access those parking lots when they need to fight an EV fire? How do they deal with the smoke? The smoke is one of the key aspects that came back in our discussion when we were setting those guidelines, because ventilation needs to be fit to actually be able to extract all the toxic gases that may come from the plastic that are in vehicles nowadays, and some of the materials that we find in batteries as well. Some of the challenges as well for parking operators and building owners. As I was explaining, there's a lot of buildings that are existing and where it's very much technically difficult to actually expand the space or install new type of firefighting measures because of the way the building is built, which would require completely destroying the building and rebuilding it to make sure that you can actually park your electric cars. So we had to identify what are some of those challenges. Can you actually deploy sprinklers everywhere, or how does that work? Can you make bigger spaces for vehicles? Those are some of the things that we've discussed in those guidelines. The question of insurers as well. They insure a lot of parking lots. They insure vehicles. They insure charging points. They insure everything. So they also have a big role there. And how do they actually cover this? How do they change their mindset as well when it comes to insurance and making sure, that they are not putting too much of a premium for electric vehicles just due to fire safety. So those were discussions that we've had, and we again address it in the guidelines. So I encourage you to read it. And then the last point is environment, which is one that we may not think about all the time. But when it comes to tackling a fire with a vehicle, whether it's electric or not, there's a lot of water that can be, involved. And usually this water ends up in the environment, and that water can be very much toxic after, encountering all the plastics and everything that's related to the batteries. And so it's important to keep this in mind. So how do we actually address that is also a big question for public authorities. As part of the work, we've also identified existing practices. It's not necessarily practices that we recommend or do not recommend. We just say they exist. This is what's happening in different member states. Feel free to learn from it and, what is actually available. Of course, practices that are bad practices were not included in those guidelines for obvious reasons. We've really focused on evidence-based data and practices that were recommended by a wider group of people, not just putting any type of practices in there. Some of these practices include, equipping battery electric vehicles with emergency cut loops, using fire-safe materials, so non-flame propagating products in recharging infrastructure and in covered parking lots, equipping covered parking lots with automatic fire detection. So that can be, the infrared camera, but that can also be, those that are related to smoke. There's different ones, and we talk about it in the guidelines. Then we are talking also about making available smoke and ventilation system, either natural or mechanical. As I mentioned, this is a key point. If you want firefighters to be able to access an underground parking lot, you need to evacuate that smoke. The question of sprinklers or water mist systems to limit propagation was discussed. It was also very much highlighted that those are not firefighting measures, but they limit propagation. So it helps to limit and to cool your vehicle while the firefighters are coming to address the fire. And then something that we don't necessarily always think about, training of personnel for strategic method of intervention, whether it's the firefighters or the parking operators that are on site, or anyone that is involved in the work around maintaining fire safety in an underground parking lot. Training is essential, and that was very much mentioned by firefighters from Norway. So we worked a lot with firefighters from Norway because they are much more advanced than we are in terms of deployment of EVs and tackling those fires. And what they were mentioning is, there's no more risk compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle. The thing is, the fire is different. So you need to, know how to address it in a different way. And so you need to learn. So those training are very much essential. Some recommendations that I'm putting here, of course, I can't put everything on the screen because there's more than that. But for private stakeholders, we are recommending to have parking operators to develop emergency plan for fires, to make sure that each parking lot actually has a plan that was, designed for this parking lot and thought, in a collective way with the other actors involved in fire safety. Equipping covered parking lots with emergency power cutoff. It's essential. If your car is plugged in and a fire starts, you need to cut the power. Otherwise, you keep alimenting the power to that electric vehicles, and this can actually worsen the situation. Also calling on qualified charging infrastructure installers. This may seem, natural, but you never say it enough. You need qualified charging infrastructure installers to put in place charging infrastructure in underground parking lots. Considering designing easier access to battery pack for firefighters. So this is up, more for a discussion with OEMs. How can you actually make sure that the battery pack is easy to reach, or how do you make sure that that information about where the battery pack is easy to reach? So there's multiple ways, and there's discussion going on with OEMs on this, but it's important to consider it as well. Then there's some recommendation for public authorities. So we encourage fire risk assessment for existing infrastructure to ensure high level of fire safety, and supporting upskilling and reskilling programs for ensuring correct installation of recharging points, but also for ensuring, good firefighting practices when it comes to BEVs. But, as I was mentioning earlier, training is essential, so won't delve too much into it. And then for users to only use recharging cables and recharging adapters approved by the manufacturers and specifically intended for recharging BEVs. We put a section on users because for us, we believe that there is a duty of care by the users. If you have damaged vehicles, you should not enter parking lots. This seems, again, very logical, but it's not always the case. So this is one idea to keep in mind. But the question of recharging cable is also a big one in the sense that you do need to use proper charging infrastructure to make sure that you're keeping the parking lot fire safe. Using regular plug to charge your vehicle is not fire safe. And so this is something that we explain and that we also debunk as well in the part about how does an EV fire work, how do charging infrastructure work, what are the different mode of charging points. So those are all aspects that are addressed in there and that should be promoted because this is key. And with this, I come to the end of my presentation. I try to limit it to 15 minutes. So thanks a lot and happy to take questions.
Thank you. So I give now the floor. 1, 2 immediate reactions from the audience. Post them in the chat, please, because I also want to have still some homework for you. Because mentioned the structured discussion, and there's no structured discussion without a nice Mentimeter and questions for the audience. If I don't see any quick question in the chat, and I don't, I will share my screen again because I want to ask you some more questions. So we go back to Mentimeter, and I hope you can see. Again, menti.com, and use the code 88795901. Very briefly, 1 minute, 2 minutes for the participants. What are the main challenges, in your opinion, on EV charging deployment? Open question. Feel free, don't be shy. Also, in view of what you listened to today, if this was inspiring or not. I can say, in my own opinion, for example, one of the things that we discussed at EVS was that, indeed, sometimes we tend to think about electromobility as something on the mobility aspects, but very obviously, and what we heard today, it's also an energy issue, even sometimes more. And these two ecosystems are not that used to work together and avoid silos. So that's quite quite a learning or a learning curve that we need to consider. So there's no challenges. Okay, then I will go for the next question. Do these STF guidelines contribute to address any challenge that you need? So are they useful? Yes, no, or just partially? Okay, partially, that's good. At least it's not a no. Of course, we know that we are not responding to everything. We try to do also identification of possible challenges, and also that's why I think these discussions are important. A little bit more time, but here seems to be a big consensus that yes, but not fully contribute to address the e-mobility challenges. So now I'm going to ask a question for the audience again, which is, what is still missing? The person that said partially, for example, if you can just briefly, one sentence, one word, what are we still missing? So what shall we address? What do you think we should look into for future recommendations and guidance? Great congestion. ultra low cost point for smart low power on street. Parking spaces on 10T, grid connections, long procedure by the governmental institutions. Installation standards. Grids are indeed an issue, and I have to say it's something that at POLIS we are looking into, and we are exchanging now for the first time, because it's indeed both the permitting, and there's this idea, this remark and complaint by the charge point operators and the industry, that both the permitting and the grid connections are big bottlenecks. And we are sometimes seen as both the DSOs and the local and the regional public authorities as a bottleneck in a streamlined process. We are going to discuss, and we are discussing, and for the first time actually between POLIS and the DSO, trying to have this dialogue to see how we can actually engage and cooperate, because again, these are two new. This is a whole new, as Aaron said, a whole new ecosystem with requirements, and public authorities are still trying to get used to this. And this is something that will take time. I also put in the chat the recommendations for the permitting and the grid connection. So they were published last year. They seem sometimes obvious, but some of the recommendations still don't exist. And I guess stakeholder dialogue will be the key, and alignment between all of this. So the charging infrastructure, but also the mobility infrastructure, mobility planning or urban planning. Indeed, it's something that we should consider. So thank you. And I go for the next question. How to ensure that these guidelines reach the right people? So for example, this is the response of a result of the STF subgroup on the public authorities. So these should be guidelines for public authorities. Of course, they also support the private side of the equation, but we do want them to reach the right people. And these are, for example, city practitioners. I'm happy that you are now aware of this, and I'm going to ask each and every one of you to please share these with your colleagues, with your networks, especially if you have access to public authorities, because we can do a bit of dissemination. We can do events like this, but it's important that these are shared as much as possible. So I guess it's not easy, given the lack of responses. There's one. Organize webinars and meetings with the national contact points for alternative fuels. This is a good idea, Alexander. And this is something that's been considered, and I will give the floor to Alexandra after this to see what she thinks of this. But indeed, we need to involve the national authorities. Establish national contact points. I guess under AFIR, we do have the NAPs, so they could be, or they should be, the let's say the go-to or the focal point on this liaison between the EU national or the STF and the national authorities. I will stop sharing for a moment, because I want to ask immediate reaction of Alexandra, Aaron, and Rafael, if you have any immediate reaction to this comments and ideas.
Should I start or I make a conclusion?
As you wish.
As you wish, yeah.
Maybe Rafael first, and then Aaron, and then
Yeah,
Alexandra.
exactly.
Sure. So, well, thanks a lot to everyone for that contribution. I think you're pointing out a lot of good points that we also have in mind. I think from our perspective at e-mobility Europe, the question of grid congestion is definitely one of the highest, and it's definitely a point that we want to address more. There's multiple legislation that are coming on related to this topic that we are addressing, and I do think that the potential guidelines would be relevant as well once we have a bit more clarity about those upcoming legislation. But definitely one of the challenge we see, and when it comes to dissemination, I agree. I think reaching out to national access point is key and will help actually disseminate this. But I guess a kind reminder to everyone in the webinar, also share those around you, because I think this is quite important. We have a saying in French, which is bouche à oreille, so mouth to ear, and it works very well. It's you pass it from one person to the other, so I think it's key to do that as well.
I think that these guidelines, a lot of these guidelines provide a lot of really good material, but of course, they're only as good as they are implemented. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in writing already, and as many of you know, I mean, even the electricity markets. I mean, when you think about what is the European, what are the different competences versus what the EU level can do versus what the member states need to do, and then the private sector or the lower level public authorities, and then the private sector, right? There is cascading levels of requirements and responsibilities for actually implementing and achieving the results, right? Electricity market design has a lot of what would be, is needed in terms of flexibility and dynamic tariffs, but it is not implemented in 26 out of 27 member states. So it's a real problem. It's not a technological problem. It's a local implementation problem. And I mean, we as a, let's say, MSP and CPO, we cannot offer smart tariffs in different markets because there's not a regulatory framework in the specific member state for offering that product to customers. So that is a fundamental problem for achieving some of these things. In the issue of parking spaces, I mean, Katarina, we obviously have the same problems as you. We know each other quite well. Those are all real. Those are all real issues. So again, good, let's say, lead in on these different documents, but it actually must be sort of aligned and implemented at the local, particularly with parking, at the really local level. And I would say also too, it's important that we, because of the capital investments that operators need to make, we need to sort of look at these things in a staged way so that we're rolling them out in proportion with the growth of the market. I mean, we would be thrilled if as EV, let's say, penetration grows, but as we need to be, let's say, proportional to the market in terms of both parking spaces, in terms of requirements of numbers of parking spaces that have charging deployment in a lower utilization environment. Even some of the EPBD guide requirements are actually quite stringent in a low utilization environment. The same goes for fully accessible parking spaces because they are larger than, let's say, non-handicap organized parking spaces. So, all of these are things that we need to take into consideration. But implementation. Last thing I'll say is all the topics related to the grid. I mean, it is the single number one largest bottleneck that we face. How long it takes, as well as the congestion issues. And of course, we know EV charging is only one of the, one of the verticals that DSOs have to deal with now, right? Along with all the other sectors that are electrifying. But we can just be much faster and are much more distributed than most other, let's say, use cases for electrification. And so it's a particular challenge for DSOs. We're working with them, and it's great to hear that POLIS is talking with them as well. But again, there's really good stuff in the Grids Action Plan, in the STF report. It just needs to be implemented. If we already were implementing some of those things, they would be moving much faster. So national energy regulators need to be part of this conversation and absolutely need to be speaking with your DSO partners as much as possible to begin to get people more oriented towards these challenges, and some of the low-hanging fruit solutions that are there, they just need to be done.
Thank you, Aaron. And indeed, it was kind of by chance. So I was talking with the person from EDSO, and they said, we are working on making some recommendations because we need to streamline cooperation. And I said, but there's already a recommendation on this that was published under the STF, and they were not aware. So it just started as an informal conversation that became, okay, and then we need to sit down and talk, because we don't need to work in circles. And if there's already stuff done, let's maybe, as you said, implement what's already being recommended. Alexandra, I will give the floor for your final words before we finalize this webinar. And thank you so much for all of you. It was quite interesting.
Thank you, Pedro. I think that a lot has been already said, but maybe I will just refer to some of the issues. somebody said, yeah, it would be good to organize webinars in specific member states. I think it is in our plans. But I have still the question, do you think that STF would be a kind of a good matching instrument between local authorities which are in less major markets and have maybe difficulty to reach authorities, for example, in Netherlands or Germany, and maybe meet them and get some more experience, so not only through guidelines, by meeting. And then somebody said that it could be good to have a EU call for funding when energy and charging is together covered. So we have such an instrument, alternative fuel infrastructure facility, but unfortunately we cannot mix with energy totally, like for example with covering grid connections. But we made some adjustment in the second call, which is now in practice, that we take into consideration more energy storage or building electrolyzers for hydrogen stations, and then also for covering some kind of cost of access to grids. So we are trying to be kind of more open, whatever we can do. And just for you, we will not know, maybe there will be new funds differently organized in future multi-annual framework. We will try to follow your ideas and maybe prepare guidelines, annexes to this guidelines, and just not to repeat the whole exercise once again. And I see that Katarina has recommended webinars and meetings with a national contact points. Yeah, we were thinking also about webinars for possible the biggest number of stakeholders and, for example, authorities and charge points operators in each country. So we will see what we can do in the real term. Thank you very much for your participation, and please share our guidelines with whoever would be interested. And thank you very much from the part of DigiMove.
Thank you, Alexandra. Let's continue to work together and make sure that we support the people on the ground that is responsible for this e-mobility transition. Thank you so much, everyone. In view also of the time, we are going to finalize the webinar. It's going to be published, so it's recorded. So we are going to soon publish together with the main takeaways. So you'll also be able to share this webinar with your colleagues. And for the moment, I wish everyone a great day, and let's keep in touch. And thank you so much for your attendance and really engaging discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Pedro.